All right, diving into something today that, well, it might not sound the most exciting at first. Enterprise fraud risk assessments. EFRAs for short. But stick with me. The stuff you send over from the UK's government counter-fraud profession, it's actually pretty fascinating. We're going to break down exactly what an EFRA is, why it matters, and look at some real-world cases.
What I find interesting is how EFRAs, they go way beyond just numbers and checklists. It's really about understanding the human side of fraud, the motivations, the pressures, even the psychology of why people take those risks.
Okay, so to start us off, when you hear fraud, what pops into your mind? I bet a lot of people think about, those Nigerian prince email scams.
Yeah, that's definitely a common perception. But when we talk about fraud in the context of organizations, it's a whole other dimension. It's any act of deception for financial or personal gain. And the impacts can be massive. We're not just talking about big corporations here. It affects everyone.
And speaking of impact, one statistic from the source material really stood out. Fraud and error cost the UK public sector somewhere between 55 and 81 billion pounds. That's a crazy amount of money.
Absolutely. It really underscores the scale of the problem and why EFRAs are so valuable. It's about understanding and managing risk, not just reacting after the fact.
So we often associate fraud with these like large-scale schemes, but you're saying it can happen in any organization.
Exactly. Think about recent cases in healthcare, finance, even charities. It's a widespread issue, and that's why EFRAs are so important. They help organizations understand their vulnerabilities and then put strategies in place to manage those risks. It's not just about compliance. It's about creating a culture of awareness and prevention.
Okay, so let's dive into the structure of an EFRA. The source breaks it down really clearly. Identifying risks, assigning owners. I'm curious, what's the thought process behind assigning those risk owners?
That's a great question. It's all about building accountability at the most effective level. So rather than the counter-fraud team owning all the risks, you want to empower individuals within specific departments to manage the risks that are, most relevant to their work.
So what are the advantages of that? Seems kind of counterintuitive to not have, like, the fraud experts directly in charge.
Well, think about it this way. The people closest to the potential risks, they're usually the ones best equipped to identify and manage them, right? They have the day-to-day knowledge, insights that a centralized team might miss. And when you give individuals ownership, well, it fosters a sense of responsibility, encourages them to be more proactive in preventing fraud.
Makes sense. I have to admit, when I saw case studies in the source material, I got a little excited. The Department for Fictional Examples. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
It really helps to, like, see how EFRAs play out in real-world situations.
Yeah. These examples are a great way to see how these, seemingly simple schemes, they can actually have these hidden fraud risks. Let's take the stair lift scheme, for instance. It's designed to help elderly or disabled individuals stay in their homes, provides funding for stair lift installations. On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward program.
Yeah, sounds pretty harmless. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, when you dig a little deeper, you start to see the vulnerabilities. The source identifies several potential fraud risks, like applicants falsely declaring their income to qualify for funding, or contractors invoicing for installations that are, substandard.
And then there's the mobility scooter scheme.
Mhm.
Seems to face similar challenges. Contractors submitting invoices for scooters that were never purchased, applicants forging medical evidence to prove they're eligible.
Right. And what's interesting is that the source highlights those external factors that are driving these risks. Things like the increased cost of living, challenging market conditions for suppliers. These pressures create a climate where fraud becomes more likely. It's not just about individual bad actors. It's about these systemic weaknesses that can be exploited.
So how do EFRAs address those weaknesses? I'm assuming there's more to it than just identifying the risks.
Absolutely. A good EFRA, it goes beyond just highlighting potential problems. It outlines strategies for mitigation. For example, in the stairlift scheme, they suggest more stringent income verification processes or implementing a system to audit a percentage of the installations just for quality control.
And for the mobility scooter scheme.
Similar strategies could apply, maybe stricter requirements for invoice submissions, cross-referencing orders with supplier records, or even implementing a whistleblower hotline for reporting suspicions of fraud.
Okay, so we're starting to see how EFRAs move from, like, theory to practice. But I'm still curious about the human element. What motivates someone to commit fraud in the first place? It seems so risky.
That's where the psychology of fraud comes in. It often boils down to a concept called the fraud triangle, which has three elements: pressure, rationalization, and opportunity.
I've heard of that, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details. Can you break it down for me and for our listeners who might be in the same boat?
Of course. So imagine someone's facing intense pressure, maybe financial difficulties, a gambling problem, or even just extreme stress. That pressure can create a motive for fraud.
Okay, that's the pressure part. But most people under pressure don't resort to criminal activity. So what's the next piece?
That's where rationalization comes in. The individual might convince themselves that they deserve the money, or that the rules don't apply to them, that they'll pay it back later. It's a way of justifying their actions, easing their conscience.
So they have the motive from the pressure. They've rationalized it away,
Mhm.
but they still need a way to actually commit the fraud.
Exactly. That's where opportunity comes into play. If there's a weakness in the system, uh, lacks oversight, lack of internal controls, it creates an opening for someone to exploit.
So EFRAs are about identifying those weaknesses, reducing those opportunities before they can be exploited.
That's a great way to put it. EFRAs are about building a culture of awareness and prevention, rather than just reacting to fraud after it's happened. And a crucial part of that is understanding the psychology, the factors that can make individuals vulnerable.
This is starting to feel really relevant, even for someone like me who isn't, directly involved in fraud risk management. I'm finding myself thinking about potential vulnerabilities in my own life, like my finances, or even my online activities.
That's a great takeaway. The principles we're discussing today, they apply far beyond the corporate world. It's about being vigilant, understanding the risks, taking steps to protect yourself in all aspects of your life. And that brings us to a crucial question. How can listeners apply these principles to their own lives, even if they're not in charge of, a massive organization? What are the key takeaways for staying safe?
Well, I think one of the most important things is knowledge is power. The more you understand about fraud, the better you'll be able to spot those red flags and protect yourself. So let's talk about some practical takeaways. What makes an EFRA really effective? What are the key elements that we can all apply, even on an individual level?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. We've covered a lot, but I'm ready for some actionable advice. Where do we even begin?
First and foremost, a good EFRA. It needs to be evidence-based. We're not talking about gut feelings. It's about data analysis, thorough understanding of how things actually work.
So instead of getting caught up in what ifs, it's about identifying real vulnerabilities. Exactly. And then there's communication. The findings of an EFRA. They need to be communicated clearly to all the relevant stakeholders. That's true for a large organization, but it also applies to families, community groups, even just talking to your friends about scams.
So having open conversations, making sure everyone's on the same page about the risks.
Absolutely. The more people who are aware of the red flags, the stronger those defenses will be. And it's not just a one-time thing. The source material emphasizes ongoing review and updates. The risk landscape is always changing, so you need to be adaptable.
Things are constantly evolving, right? New scams pop up all the time.
Right, whether it's your personal finances, your online security, or even just evaluating opportunities that sound too good to be true. It's about having that awareness.
Okay, so we've defined fraud, explored the components of an EFRA, delved into some real-world examples. But I think what our listeners really want are those practical tips. How can they apply this knowledge in their own lives, even if they're not directly involved in, fraud risk management?
Well, going back to that fraud triangle is a great start, remember. Pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. If you see someone in a position of trust who is facing pressure, maybe financial difficulties, a gambling problem, or even just extreme stress, that's a potential red flag.
Okay, so be mindful of the pressure element.
Hmm.
What about rationalization? How can our listeners spot that?
Listen for those attempts to justify bad behavior. Things like, everyone's doing it, or I deserve this. Those are classic rationalizations.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
And then, of course, there's the opportunity piece.
right. Be mindful of opportunities for fraud. Weak passwords, lacks oversight of financial transactions, or even just situations where someone might be able to take advantage of a lack of awareness. The more you can reduce those opportunities, the less likely fraud is to occur.
It's almost like those crime prevention tips, right?
Yeah.
Like making sure your doors are locked and your valuables are out of sight. You're not making it impossible,
Yeah.
but you're making it a lot harder.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, creating those layers of protection.
This is really helpful. It feels empowering to understand these concepts and to know that we can all take steps to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't just about protecting yourself. It's also about protecting your community, whether it's your workplace, a volunteer group, or even just your family and friends. By being aware of these risks and taking steps to mitigate them, you're contributing to a safer environment.
Now, we focused primarily on organizational fraud, But these principles apply to our personal lives as well, right?
Absolutely. Think about online scams, identity theft, those phishing emails. And then there are those everyday situations where someone might try to deceive you. Maybe it's a contractor cutting corners, a salesperson inflating prices, or even just someone trying to get ahead in line unfairly.
So how do we navigate those situations? I mean, we can't be suspicious of everyone, right?
You're right, it's not about being paranoid. It's about applying critical thinking. Don't just accept things at face value. Question assumptions. Look for inconsistencies. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is.
That's a good reminder. It's so easy to get caught up in our busy lives. But taking a moment to pause to question that can make all the difference.
It really can. And remember, there are resources available. If you're ever unsure about something, don't hesitate to reach out to a trusted advisor or a law enforcement agency. Talking it through with someone can help.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm definitely going to be more mindful of these things.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, awareness is the first step. The more we talk about these issues, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves and our communities.
Okay, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, but before we wrap up, I want to circle back to one of the key points, the human element. Because at the end of the day, fraud is about people making choices.
Yes, understanding those motivations, those pressures, and those rationalizations, it's crucial for developing effective prevention strategies. It's not just about systems and controls, it's about understanding the human vulnerabilities.
It's like we were saying earlier, most people aren't inherently bad. But anyone can be tempted under the right circumstances.
Exactly, and that's why creating a culture of ethics and integrity is so important. It's about fostering an environment where people feel comfortable speaking up. If they see something suspicious, where they're encouraged to report potential wrongdoing, and where ethical behavior is rewarded.
And that goes for both organizations and individuals, right?
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to promote ethical behavior and to hold ourselves and others accountable.
Well said. It's easy to get caught up in the technicalities, but ultimately it's about doing the right thing. And sometimes doing the right thing means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable. If you see something suspicious, don't be afraid to report it. You might be surprised at the impact you can have.
That's such an important point. Silence only benefits those who are perpetrating fraud. By speaking up, we can create a culture of accountability. So, to wrap things up, I think the biggest takeaway from this deep dive is that fraud is a complex issue with far-reaching consequences. It's not just a problem for big corporations or government agencies. It affects all of us.
And while it can be daunting to think about the scale of the problem, it's also empowering to know that we can all play a role in preventing it. By understanding the risks, being vigilant, and speaking up when necessary, we can make a real difference.
Okay, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, but before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought. Remember that statistic we mentioned earlier about the staggering cost of fraud to the UK public sector? Well, imagine if we could redirect even a fraction of that money to something positive. Imagine the impact we could have on healthcare, education, social services. The possibilities are endless.
That's a powerful thought, and it really underscores why this work is so important. Preventing fraud, it's not just about numbers, it's about people's lives.
Exactly. So next time you're in a situation where you think, is this fraud? Remember the bigger picture, the consequences, and that you taking a stand, well, it makes a difference. It contributes to a more ethical world.
It's easy to think it's just my little world over here. But fraud, it's got these ripple effects. We're all connected whether we realize it or not.
We've talked about the signs of fraud, how to protect ourselves, but what about when we suspect something's off? What do we actually do?
That's a great question. And it can be tricky. Sometimes we brush it off, think we're overreacting. But honestly, it's always better to be safe than sorry.
So report every little thing.
Well, no, it's a judgment call. But if you've got a genuine concern, if something feels wrong in your gut, speak up. Talk to someone you trust, a supervisor, a coworker, a friend. Sometimes just saying it out loud helps.
And if it's nothing, well, no harm done.
Exactly. Better safe than sorry. And who knows, you might stop a bigger problem from happening.
That's a great point for our listeners. Don't underestimate speaking up.
Absolutely. And remember, there's help out there. Hotlines, organizations dedicated to this. You don't have to go it alone.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, learned a ton, not just about EFRAs, but about the human element of all this.
Me too. And it shows that fraud, it's not just for the experts to figure out. It's on all of us to be aware, to be proactive.
So bottom line,
Yeah.
stay informed, stay vigilant, and if something's not right, say something.
Yeah.
It matters.
Well said. It's been great chatting with you.
Same here. And to our listeners, that wraps up our deep dive into enterprise fraud risk assessments. Hope you found it useful, insightful, and, hey, maybe even a little empowering. Till next time, stay curious, stay safe.